This morning, we're going to place ourselves at the cross. We're going to look at Christ's death from the perspective of the onlookers, what these people saw, what some of them should have understood, what few of them did understand with clear knowledge of prophecy. We're going to look at Matthew's account for the most part of the crucifixion, and we're also going to look at the prophecy in Psalm 22. I think we've all read these accounts many a time. But every time I read Psalm 22, I'm amazed at the line-by-line accuracy of this prophecy. And so I think it's good from time to time to look at it again. Not every prophecy that we see is that easy to tie so directly to events that are that happen in the future. And so I want to focus on that this morning. And we're thinking about the gravity of Christ's death, what it means to us, and it's of such import that we celebrate it every week. We probably think about it every day. And also we're thinking about the account and the prophecy together, really so that we can just sit again in awe of God's perfect plan. It gives us more motivation to give him glory and honor. It's always pretty fascinating to me to see how God fulfills his promises and the prophecies of his prophets many hundreds of years and sometimes more, sometimes 1,000 years later or more. And it's interesting to see how those actions, and again, it gives us confidence when we see these prophecies fulfilled that God does what he says he's going to do in his time. And, you wouldn't think about the Psalms of David and these prophecies, and you think, if you're in David's time, okay, well, when is that going to happen? And you think about that from the perspective of our seats. It was 1,000 years or more before that stuff happened. It was 28 generations, it says in the genealogy of Christ. It's interesting to see how these actions of the people at the cross, they wanted to disprove Christ, were in fact affirming his deity at the time. With the benefit of hindsight, we see all that so clearly. And we know we have the benefit of hindsight. It's hard not to question just how these so-called learned scholars that if they were so familiar with Jewish law and history and prophecy that they would have been able to see themselves fulfilling every utterance of the prophecy. How could dying as a condemned criminal prove that somebody is important or special? The point that I want to make this morning is that the cross proved that Jesus was the Christ. In Matthew chapter 27, Jesus' manner of death convinced the Roman centurion and his guard that he was the Son of God. No crucifixion that they had performed or witnessed had ever been like this. But for Bible-believing Jews, just hearing his words and looking around should have convinced them of the same thing. Matthew chapter 27, we'll read the account there beginning with verse 45. Now from the 6th hour there was darkness over all the land until the 9th hour. And about the 9th hour Jesus cried out with a loud voice, saying, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani? That is, my God, why have you forsaken me? And some of the bystanders hearing it said, This man is calling Elijah. And one of them at once ran and took a sponge, filled it with sour wine, and put it on a reed, and gave it to him to drink. But the other said, Wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to save him. And Jesus cried out again with a loud voice and yielded up his spirit. And behold, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, and the earth shook, and the rocks were split. The tombs also were open, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. And coming out of the tombs after his resurrection, they went into the holy city and appeared to many. When the centurion and those who were with him, keeping watch over Jesus, saw the earthquake and what took place, they were filled with awe, and they said, Truly, this was the Son of God. There were also many women there, looking on from a distance, who had followed Jesus from Galilee, ministering to him, among whom were Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, and the mother of the sons of Zebedee. When he spoke the words, my God, why have you forsaken me? He expressed the strong feelings of a righteous man pleading to God in most trying times. But he In echoing the opening words of Psalm 22, he's expressing the emotion of someone in a similar circumstance of oppression and despair. There's a lot of confusion about that passage. A lot of it, I think, is unnecessary or possibly ignorant. Folks would make the argument, and I don't intend to be dogmatic about this, but folks make the argument that, well, in bearing the sins of the world, there was this spiritual separation between God and Jesus at the moment. I just don't think that that's the case. I think, in fact, when you look at Psalm 22, again, I said I'm not going to be dogmatic about this, but Jesus quotes the first line of a song that prophesied some 1,000 years before at the exact time that this prophecy was being fulfilled. He's clearly indicating this is the fulfillment of a prophecy. And he's doing it in a way cooler way than just looking down and saying, hey, look, this is exactly what David said 1,000 years ago would happen to the Messiah. And so he quotes the first line of this prophecy, and then with the benefit of the hindsight, we can see everything that happened in that prophecy is what's happening in the current moment. Psalm chapter 22, or the 22nd Psalm, beginning with verse 1. My God, why have you forsaken me? Sound familiar? Why are you so far from saving me from the words of my groaning? Oh my God, I cry by day, but you do not answer, and by night, but I find no rest. Yet you are holy, enthroned on the praises of Israel. In you our fathers trusted. They trusted and you delivered them. To you they cried and were rescued. In you they trusted and were not put to shame. But I am a worm and not a man, scorned by mankind and despised by the people. And in verse 7 and 8, all who see me mock me. They make mouths at me. They wag their heads. He trusts in the Lord. Let him deliver him. Let him rescue him, for he delights in him. Does that ring any bells? Just a few minutes before Jesus quoted the first verse of this psalm, everyone around him was mocking him and ridiculing him in exactly the same way of the prophecy. Matthew chapter 7, verse 39. And those who passed by derided him, wagging their heads and saying, you who would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself. If you're the Son of God, come down from the cross. So also the chief priests with the scribes and elders mocked him, saying, he saved others, he cannot save himself. He is the King of Israel. Let him come down now from the cross and we'll believe him. He trusts in God. Let God deliver him now. That's Psalm 22, if he desires him. For he said, I am the Son of God. And the robbers who were crucified with him also reviled him in the same way. In verse 43, we're told that the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders mocked him with the exact words of Psalm 22 and verse 8. You can see them side by side here. Again, with hindsight, we wonder how they couldn't see what they were saying, or in this case, confirming. You think, well, maybe they just chose the words of a well-known psalm because they wanted to add a touch of biblical authority to their mockery. But if they did it consciously and they chose to mock Jesus with the words which, in context, were spoken by the wicked against the righteous, the one unjustly suffering, you just think, it's too on the nose. So now you have two different people at the cross who have directly quoted two different parts of the psalm. Jesus, his enemies, and also Jesus himself. Psalm 22 was a prophecy of the crucifixion, beginning with verse 14 of that psalm. I'm poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax, it is melted within my breast. My strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue sticks to my jaws. You lay me in the dust of death. I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax, it is melted. I think I put that in there twice. According to Matthew, just hearing Jesus speak made someone want to give him something to drink. His tongue clung to his jaws. We saw in Matthew chapter 27 and verse 46, about the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice. And then somebody immediately ran and took a sponge, and they filled it with sour wine, and they put it on a reed and gave it to him to drink. John's gospel tells us that the soldiers also pierced his side, and blood and water came out. The psalmist said, I am poured out like water. My heart is like wax. It's melted within me. In verse 16, for dogs encompass me. A company of evildoers encircles me. They have pierced my hands and feet. Historians credit, I'm not an expert here, historians credit the Persians with inventing crucifixion. David wrote this psalm where he said, "They have pierced my hands and my feet," about 500 years or so before the rise of Persia, and again about 1,000 years before Jesus died. Yet those standing at the cross who have just heard this psalm quoted twice can look up and see a man whose hands and feet have been pierced, just as Psalm 22 describes. Again, I'm not suggesting necessarily that crucifixion didn't exist before then, but history would indicate that David wrote these things before crucifixion existed. The idea existed. And so it just kind of leaves you in awe. The evidence mounts even further in verse 17 and 18. "I can count all my bones. They stare and gloat over me. They divide my garments among them, and for my clothes they cast lots." Those standing at the cross who have just heard the psalm quoted twice have seen the soldiers at the foot of the cross plundering the victims of the crucifixion, and doing so they're carrying out exactly the words of the same psalm. Matthew chapter 27, beginning with verse 35. "And when they had crucified him, they divided his garments among them by casting lots. Then they sat down and kept watch over him there." Matthew tells us this happened in order to fulfill this verse, but clearly the events of the cross are bring to our view and fulfill the whole psalm. The cross was supposed to be the final proof that Jesus was not the Christ. The religious leaders strongly denied his claims to be the Christ, which were the grounds for his death sentence. Matthew chapter 26, beginning with verse 62. "And the high priest stood up and said, 'Have you no answer to make? What is it that these men testify against you?' But Jesus remained silent. And the high priest said to him, 'I adjure you by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God.' Jesus said to him, 'You have said so. But I tell you, from now on you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven.' Then the high priest tore his robes and said, 'He has uttered blasphemy. What further witness do we need? You have now heard his blasphemy. What is your judgment?' They answered, 'He deserves death.' If any of the on the Sanhedrin had any doubts, the idea was that seeing him hanging on a cross would have removed those doubts, that his death on a cross would confirm that he's a blasphemer and a liar. In Deuteronomy, Moses, in delivering the law to the people in chapter 21, beginning with verse 22, says, "If a man has committed a crime punishable by death, and he is put to death, and you hang him on a tree, his body shall not remain all night on the tree, but you shall bury him the same day. For a hanged man is cursed by God. You shall not defile your land that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance." In their minds, the death sentence was the final proof that his claims were false. If he were truly the Christ, there would be no way that he'd allow himself to be treated this way. If he were truly the Christ, there's no way that God would allow him to be treated this way. And there would have been some kind of supernatural intervention. But then, in the light of Psalm 22, we see that everything changes. Putting Psalm 22 beside Matthew 27, the crucifixion instead becomes a glorious affirmation that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, the King of the Jews. And the force of the arguments really multiplied when we stop to reflect on all of these prophecies fulfilled involved people and events that were completely outside the control of the one who hung on the cross. He wasn't compelling them to confirm his deity in that moment. He simply quoted the psalm that was being fulfilled minute by minute in detail by everybody else around him. In fact, I find it poetic and very neat that he did it that way, alluded to just the first line of the psalm. In Psalm 22, the speaker is a righteous man who's surrounded by his enemies. All who are present on that day and recognize this psalm coming to pass can't doubt that Jesus had been condemned unjustly and must therefore be everything that he claimed to be. Skip that one. Matthew chapter 27, verse 37. And over his head they put a charge against him, which read, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." God appears to have abandoned him, probably from the perspective of those who put him to death. Enemies of overwhelming power surround him in this instance. He can't defend himself as they cruelly mock him. But that was only appearance. The rest of the psalm reveals the reality, beginning with verse 21 of the 22nd psalm. Save me from the mouth of the lion. You have rescued me from the horns of the wild oxen. I will tell of your name to my brothers. In the midst of the congregation, I will praise you. You who fear the Lord, praise him. All you offspring of Jacob, glorify him and stand in awe of him. All you offspring of Israel. For he has not despised or abhorred the affliction of the afflicted, and he has not hidden his face from him, but has heard when he cried to him. Jesus maybe appeared to have been forsaken by God. God did hear him. The same one who was brought to the dust of death later praised the name of God to his brethren, as we see in that psalm. So if we know that the subject of this psalm is not just close to death, but actually died, then the rest of the psalm takes on a new meaning. It becomes a prophecy also of resurrection. Beginning with verse 27, all the ends of the earth shall remember and turn to the Lord, and all the families of the nations shall worship you. For kingship belongs to the Lord, and he rules over the nations. Not only that, the nations, seeing and remembering what happened, turned to the Lord, beginning with the Roman centurion who crucified him. The cross, we know, proved that Jesus was the Christ. Viewed superficially, the cross still seems to be that proof that Jesus was nothing special, but closer examination reveals Jesus is everything he claimed to be, and that ought to be a lesson to us. We know, based on the errors of short-sighted scholars and religious leaders, that we need the perspective that the Word provides. That if we claim to be scholars of the Bible, we need to make sure that we're not guilty of the same thing. We have to walk circumspectly. We have to be careful about rushing to judgment that's led by our emotion. Clearly, that's what they did. But judge according to the wisdom that God provides. The difference between these two perspectives is the difference between wisdom and foolishness. They stand up here and make fun of these people for what they didn't realize that they were doing at the time. We can be guilty of the same thing. We need the wisdom that God provides. The difference between wisdom and foolishness, or the difference between perishing and salvation is in there also. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, beginning with verse 18 says, for the word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the discernment of the discerning I will thwart. Where is the one who is wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God, the world did not know God through wisdom, it pleased God through the folly of what we preach to save those who believe. For Jews demand signs and Greeks seek wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to the Jews and folly to the Gentiles, but to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. Christ, the wisdom and power of God. This verse is really powerful when we see all of this in context. The account of his death with the fulfillment of the prophecy by the ignorant in that moment. Can we recognize the power of God and the wisdom of God shown at the cross? With this study, we also encourage other people to recognize it. And with that knowledge, there's really just one response to that, to submit to Jesus, to the knowledge that he was proven to be the Christ, even as he was dying, by the prophecies of Psalm 22, which were again abundantly proven by his resurrection from the dead. If folks can see that, then again, the natural response is to turn away from sin and every other allegiance, and with wholehearted worship, serve Jesus the Christ, the Son of God. And that's the message that we bring to people. The reason that Jesus suffered on the cross was not to get our attention or just to fulfill an Old Testament prophecy, which is both of those things clearly happen in this case. They get our attention, they fulfill the prophecy. But because the only way to remove the curse of sin that is hanging over our heads was by taking it upon himself. Galatians chapter 3. For all who rely on works of the law are under a curse, for it is written, cursed be everyone who does not abide by all things written in the book of the law and do them. We violated God's law, so we're under that curse. But in verse 13 and 14, Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. For it is written, cursed is everyone who is hanged on a tree, so that in Christ Jesus the blessing of Abraham might come to the Gentiles, so that we might receive the promised Spirit through faith. That brings our lesson this morning to a conclusion. I want to encourage us to focus our minds on that. Folks in this room are probably think about this every day, but it's important that we share this message to other people, and certainly to encourage us to continue to focus our minds, especially, in a few minutes we're going to consider his memorial feast. That it's important for us to remember that in Christ Jesus, God showers his blessings on us, that we might receive what it says here, the promised Spirit through faith. I appreciate your attention this morning. We're going to now sing song number 271 as an encouragement. Please stand as we sing number 271.